Hey everyone. This week we're jumping from the Regency era to the Victorian, and we're reading Charles Dickens' short Christmas novel, A Christmas Carol. To many, Charles Dickens is the quintessential Victorian novelist, and while A Christmas Carol might not frequently be considered his greatest literary work, not that it's asparaged, of course, it definitely is his most popular story today. I also think that, well, we also usually think of it as a fun story to bring out at Christmas time. It, in fact, is a nice window into the Victorian world. The changes that were happening in the middle of the 19th century, the things that people cared about, and the debates that were occurring. In today's lecture, I want to give a brief overview of who Charles Dickens was, who the Victorians were, what was happening during this time in history, and also give you a little bit of background information into the genre of the social reform novel, which Dickens popularized. So, to start off with some Charles Dickens biography, Charles Dickens's father, John, was a Navy clerk who met his wife, Charles's mother, Elizabeth, because her father and brother were working in the same office. This provided enough money in the early years of marriage and family to live more or less comfortably. The two oldest children, Charles being one of them, were sent to school, but it was not enough to keep John Dickens from going into debt. So when the family moved to London, they had to downsize to a much smaller house, and even then, debts grew. And by February of 1824, John Dickens, Charles' father, was thrown into debtor's prison because he was unable to pay his debts. That's what happened when you weren't able to pay debts in the Victorian era. And so during this time, Charles Dickens had to work. He was sent to a blackening factory where they made basically shoe polish, and he put the labels on that shoe polish. And even after his father left prison in May of that year, Dickens continued to work in that factory for several months. Eventually, he was able to go back to school for a short period of time, but then the family ran out of money again, and he had to work at age 15. He began working as an assistant in a law office and eventually would become a courtroom reporter. He found the law to be tedious. This is something we see throughout many of his works. But his work as a journalist allowed him a career in writing that would eventually shift to his literary works and his novels. Well, I think that Dickens' early life is the most important to consider as an influence in his later works, and I think that we'll see some of that influence even in A Christmas Carol. Um, I do want to mention one part of his story that might be perhaps a darker strain in that story. Um, and that's his marriage and eventual desertion of his wife Catherine. Though their marriage had started peacefully enough, Dickens grew to resent her. The two of them had 10 children, between the demands of a large household as well as the death of a daughter at only 8 months old, Catherine's mental health significantly suffered. And obviously, just the demands of um, a large family like that, not necessarily being from a very wealthy position, would put a lot of stress on any woman, of course. So, added to this was an extramarital affair that Dickens had with a young 18-year-old actress that happened to be the same age as one of his daughters at the time, so much younger than he was. And so all of this came together to a divorce. And as he proceeded to divorce Catherine, Dickens attempted to vindicate himself and probably move this divorce along while um, keeping his reputation together. Dickens would publish works which denied the affair, painted his wife as an uncaring mother, implied mental instability. And I mention this not because I think it has a direct impact on A Christmas Carol or because it means that we shouldn't read the works of Charles Dickens, but I do think that's really important. Um, that we be honest about our literary heroes, have a full picture, including the good and the bad. And I think that very few people in British literary history are celebrated at the level of Charles Dickens, especially within the last 200 years. I think he's one of the most popular literary figures of British culture. And so I think it's really important that we understand a full picture of who he was. I want to shift now to Victorian history and culture a little bit and introduce the Victorian era. The Victorian era was well named because it was the reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. During this time, Britain saw significant growth and change. It might be one of the periods of history in which some of the greatest change happened in some of the shortest period of time. The areas I want to focus on in this lecture are industrialization, empire, science, and religion. It's a lot. I'm going to go through it very quickly, but hopefully you'll get a taste of what was happening during this period. So the Industrial Revolution began before the Victorian era, but it gained great steam. That's an industrialization joke for you. From 1830 through the end of the century, as the first modern railways were developed, telegraphs and telephones were invented, factories grew, automobile engines were developed. Lots of development in a very short period of time. Victorian England saw itself as the center of progress, indeed, celebrating the progress during the 1851 Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, shortened as the Great Exhibition, which was known not only for showcasing the industrial progress of the nation and the world, but also for a crystal palace, which became kind of iconic. It was this iron and glass structure. It was larger than St. Paul's Cathedral, right in the middle of Hyde Park. And it stood as kind of this monument of the modern age and its spirit and its progress, its strength and its beauty. Victorians saw themselves as innovators at home, as all of this points to, but they also sought to spread what they viewed as the glories of Western development throughout the world. Queen Victoria was not only Queen of England, but also Empress of the British Empire. By the mid 19th century, Britain controlled and or ruled India, parts of southern China, several parts of Africa, and several parts of the Caribbean. The saying "the sun never sets on the British Empire" refers to the fact that, or referred to the fact that Britain controlled so much of the world at the time. There was always daytime in at least one British imperial territory. And although Britain had banned both the slave trade and slavery before many other nations, including the United States, it's worth noting that not only the slave trade enabled the growth of the British Empire leading up to and in the very beginning of the Victorian era, but also that, or I guess, I'm sorry, slave trade had been abolished right before the Victorian era began. But I think it's also worth noting that racist attitudes towards non-Western world nations continue to guide England's attitude and actions towards empire throughout the 19th and 20th century. The shift from conquering the world to civilizing it was a bit of a shift in language, more than a shift in attitude, perhaps. It continued to view the non Western people as kind of infantilized heathens that needed the guidance of a white savior. And while some Victorian resistance to empire did come from a distaste for this attitude, I don't want to pretend like this was a uniformed everyone gun ho about it thing. Some of that did come from a legitimate interest for the autonomy of people of the world, but a lot of it came not necessarily from this good natured, advanced, evolved mindset towards the world, but rather just from a fear of what this engagement with less developed nations could mean for Britain. So, things like the drugs that came from China, the disease that was killing soldiers and their families in India, the influence of world religions. These were as much a part of kind of that fear of empire that was present in some of Victorian England as perhaps a more morally guided dislike of what Britain was doing. And of course, much of Victorian England was in support of these imperial um, ventures. But the Victorians continued to explore the world, and one of the most famous results of that exploration would be the documented in Charles Darwin's Origins of Species. Darwin's observation that species adapt, leading to an understanding of biological evolution, was perhaps one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the 19th century. Um, Paired with archaeology and anthropology, it suggested a new framework for understanding the stability of the living world and the human centeredness of the living world, though it would be used in racial, misogynistic, eugenic ways moving forward. But it did give a sense of instability to the idea of reality as the Victorian world had understood it up until that point. Um, One of the major impacts of industrialization, empire, and scientific progress in the Victorian era was its impact on the Christian faith. The rapid changes happening in the world around them caused many Victorians to struggle to see the relevancy of religious tradition in their everyday lives, and many turned their focus toward concrete human progress instead of spirituality. The growth of the British Empire meant that many Victorians were increasingly aware of the multitude of world religions that seemed to challenge the centrality of a Christian narrative in the world. An increased scholarly interest in Greek and Roman literature throughout the 19th century also caused many to be more interested in antiquity than in Christianity. And the scientific and archaeology or the archaeological discoveries of the time throughout the world seem to challenge parts of the biblical narrative about world history. This sometimes led to increased secularization, and at other times it led to changes in how people understood and related to their religious traditions. And this is something that we will explore further in the supplementary readings I'm going to share this week. I know this is a long lecture, but we are getting to our last part, and that is discussing the genre of the social reform novel, which I think A Christmas Carol is adjacent to. So, along with the changes experienced by England during the Victorian era came new social problems. Industrialization meant that large factories developed, which caused significant pollution. Working class people were moving into cities in just large numbers in order to work in these factories. And also, there was this over reliance on the labor of women, some of whom were, very pregnant at times when prenatal care was very rudimentary. Sometimes women bringing babies to the factory because they didn't have childcare, or leaving children at home until the children were old enough to work in these factories. So, very poor conditions in the factories. That were right in the heart of these cities. All of these problems were highly visible. And then on top of that, this all meant that the factory owners and others who profited from industrialization became a newly emerging middle class, or what Marx would call the bourgeoisie. This caused a few different concerns. First, the problems of the working class and the poor were more apparent in greater numbers when they happened in crowded cities. So people were more aware of the problems that poor people were facing, and poor people were facing new problems during the Victorian era than they had experienced in previous centuries. Secondly, some people had kind of this bourgeoisie class had what we might call today new money. This British gentry and aristocracy had always considered, or the British gentry and aristocracy had always considered their class as much a matter of manners and social responsibility. Um, it's kind of noblesse oblige. The noble class is obliged to serve attitude. It was as much that as a matter of money. So many worried what would happen when people without basically this good breeding, this inborn sense of responsibility, as the upper classes would consider it. What would happen when these people had so much wealth and so much power in society? So, middle class morality became a really important topic, both because it was seen to be the backbone of this new, well-running society, um, and because the middle class owners of the means of production was also most immediately responsible for the conditions of the working class. So, Charles Dickens focuses significantly on issues of social responsibility and morality in his novels. You know, having worked as a child himself, having had a father who was imprisoned for debt, his works are deeply concerned with how those with money make choices that hurt those without, with a special interest in how children are hurt um, by this class system and the lack of structuring and support for the poor around it. He also, though, shines a light on broader social issues that speak to the Reformation efforts sought by more progressive politicians and writers of the day. Several of his works can be considered part of the Victorian genre of social reform novels, novels that seek to show the ways that policy, social lack of responsibility, and individual decisions combine to damage the lives of vulnerable populations, and that implicitly or explicitly, these works implicitly or explicitly argue for legal and social reforms. And Dickens himself would explicitly appear to argue for social reform in Victorian England. So, this lecture has covered a lot of ground very quickly. I appreciate you sticking with me through it all. And I really hope that we can dive deeper into many of these issues as we read Victorian literature throughout the rest of this term. I hope that's laid a foundation, but it's one that we will definitely build on. And feel free to ask questions along the way if there's anything about which you would like more information. Thank you and have a really good week.